The studio lights burned hot, casting sharp shadows across the polished floor of Jimmy Kimmel's set. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their murmurs rippling through the air like static before a storm. Johnny Depp sat in the guest chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the room like a man who'd walked through too many ambushes to trust a warm welcome. His black leather jacket hung loosely over a faded shirt, and his signature rings glinted under the stage lights, catching the eye of every camera trained on him. Kimmel, all smiles and practiced charm, leaned forward, his tie perfectly knotted, his grin just a touch too wide for the moment. The crowd didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness something raw, something unscripted, something that would be dissected on every entertainment blog by morning. Kimmel kicked things off with his usual flair, tossing softballs about Johnny's latest project, a gritty indie film that had critics whispering about an Oscar. Johnny answered with his trademark wit, his voice low and deliberate, each word chosen with care. He spoke about the role, a tormented artist grappling with addiction, and how it hit close to home. The audience leaned in, captivated by the vulnerability in his tone, the way he seemed to peel back layers most celebrities kept hidden. But Kimmel, ever the showman, wasn't content to let the moment breathe. He pivoted, his smile sharpening as he brought up the elephant in the room. Johnny's recent legal battles, the tabloid circus that had dogged him for years. "So, Johnny," Kimmel said, his voice dripping with that casual tone that masks a loaded question. "You've been through a lot lately, stuff most people can't even imagine. How do you keep it together when the whole world's picking apart your life?" The audience laughed nervously, sensing the shift. Johnny's smile tightened, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. He tilted his head, studying Kimmel like a painter sizing up a blank canvas. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his voice steady but edged with something darker, "the world loves a good story. Doesn't matter if it's true. They'll tear you apart to sell a headline, and you just learn to live with the noise." The crowd clapped, but it was hesitant, like they weren't sure if they were supposed to. Kimmel nodded, undeterred, and pressed on. "Sure, but come on. Some of those headlines, they've got to sting, right? I mean, you've had your personal life dragged through the mud, lawsuits, all that drama with your ex. How do you not let that define you?" The question hung in the air, heavy, invasive. Johnny's jaw clenched, just for a second, but long enough for the cameras to catch it. The audience went quiet, the air thick with tension. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's. "Define me," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Jimmy, the only one defining me is me. The rest is just chatter." Kimmel laughed, trying to defuse the moment, but it came out forced. He shuffled his note cards, a telltale sign he was rattled, and tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Fair enough, he said, waving a hand. "Let's talk about something lighter. Your music. Man, you're out there jamming with your band, living the rock star life." But Johnny wasn't biting. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression unreadable. "You want to talk music, Jimmy? Or you want to keep digging into my life, like it's a soap opera?" The crowd gasped, a few people laughing nervously, but the room felt like it was holding its breath. Kimmel's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered with a chuckle. "Hey, I'm just asking what the people want to know," he said, gesturing to the audience, who offered a weak cheer. Johnny didn't respond right away. He just stared at Kimmel, his silence louder than any words. The cameras zoomed in, catching the intensity in his eyes, the way his fingers tightened around the armrest. It was clear this wasn't going to be the usual late-night fluff. Something was brewing, and everyone in the room could feel it. The silence stretched, a taut wire ready to snap. Johnny Depp's stare bore into Jimmy Kimmel, unyielding, while the host shifted in his seat, his chuckle fading into an awkward cough. The audience, sensing the shift, sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two men. The stage lights seemed harsher now, highlighting the sweat beading on Kimmel's forehead. He tried to pivot again, leaning into his everyman charm. "All right, Johnny, let's lighten it up," he said, forcing a grin. "You're a man of many talents. Actor, musician, producer. What's the secret to juggling it all?" It was a safe question, a lifeline, but Johnny wasn't reaching for it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low and deliberate. "You want to know the secret? Jimmy, it's simple. You don't let people put you in a box. You don't let them decide who you are or what you're worth." His words were measured, but there was fire behind them, a quiet intensity that made the audience lean in closer. Kimmel nodded, trying to keep up, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Sure, he said, "but you know, the fans, they're curious about the man behind the roles. Like, what's a day in the life of Johnny Depp really like?" Johnny's laugh was sharp, more a scoff than amusement. "A day in my life. You don't want to know about my mornings, Jimmy. You want the dirt, the gossip, the stuff that keeps the tabloids in business." The crowd murmured, a mix of gasps and uneasy laughter. Kimmel raised his hands, playing the innocent card. Whoa, I'm just trying to give the people what they want," he said, glancing at the audience for support. A few clapped, but it was half-hearted. The room still caught in Johnny's orbit. "You know what they want?" Johnny said, his voice rising just enough to command the room. "They want real. They're tired of the same recycled stories, the same tired narratives. I'm not here to feed that machine." He gestured to the audience, his rings catching the light. "These people, they're not here for gossip. They're here for something honest." The crowd erupted, applause thundering through the studio. But it wasn't the usual polite cheer. It was raw, almost defiant, like they were rallying behind him. Kimmel, caught off guard, tried to regain control. "Okay, Johnny, I hear you," he said, his tone conciliatory. "Let's talk honest. Then, your new film, it's getting a lot of buzz, but some say it's a risky move, going indie after all those big blockbusters. What made you take that leap?" It was a decent recovery, but Johnny wasn't playing along. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Risky? You think telling a real story is risky? Maybe it's riskier to keep churning out the same soulless stuff Hollywood loves to sell." The audience roared again, louder this time, feeding off his energy. Kimmel's smile was starting to crack. He glanced at his producers off stage, a subtle plea for guidance, but none came. "Hey, I'm all for real stories," he said, trying to match Johnny's intensity. "But, you know, sometimes the business, it's tough. You've got to play the game a little, right?" Johnny shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I stopped playing that game a long time ago, Jimmy. That's why I'm still here." The crowd was on its feet now, clapping, cheering, a wave of support that seemed to catch Kimmel by surprise. For a moment, it looked like the tension might ease, like Johnny's words had shifted the dynamic into something manageable. But then Kimmel made a mistake. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Come on, Johnny, you can't tell me you don't miss the big budgets, the red carpets, the whole Hollywood machine. You were the king of that world." The air changed, like a storm cloud rolling in. Johnny's smirk vanished, replaced by a look that could cut glass. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, his chair scraping against the floor. The audience went silent, every eye on him, waiting for what came next. Johnny Depp stood tall, his silhouette cutting a stark figure against the bright studio backdrop. The audience held its breath, the air thick with anticipation, as if the room itself was waiting for the next move. His leather jacket creaked faintly. As he crossed his arms, his gaze locked on Jimmy Kimmel, who sat frozen behind his desk, his practiced smile now a thin, uneasy line. The camera swiveled, capturing every angle of the moment, the tension so palpable it seemed to hum through the studio. Johnny's voice, when he spoke, was low, deliberate, each word landing like a stone. "King of that world, Jimmy, you think that's what I was aiming for? A crown from a machine that chews up anyone who doesn't play by its rules?" Kimmel blinked, caught off guard by the intensity. He opened his mouth to respond, but Johnny didn't give him the chance. "You want to talk about Hollywood?" he continued, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "It's a game of mirrors, all smoke and shadows. They build you up, call you a king, then tear you down the second you step out of line. I'm done with that." The audience erupted, a mix of cheers and gasps, some standing now, drawn into the raw honesty of his words. It wasn't just a talk show moment anymore. It felt like a reckoning. Kimmel, scrambling to regain footing, leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Whoa, Johnny, I didn't mean to strike a nerve," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying, you've had a hell of a career, man. Pirates, Edward Scissorhands, all of it. People love you for that." He gestured to the crowd, hoping to pull them back to his side, but their applause was for Johnny, not him. The host's eyes darted to the side, catching a producer's subtle nod, a signal to steer things back to script. But Johnny wasn't following anyone's script. People love the work. "Jimmy," Johnny said, stepping closer to the desk, his presence commanding the stage. "Not the headlines, not the gossip, not the machine. The work. That's what keeps me going, not some fantasy about being Hollywood's darling." His voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in conviction, and the crowd responded, their cheers louder, more unified. A woman in the front row shouted, "We love you, Johnny," and the room exploded again, the energy tilting decisively in his favor. Kimmel, visibly rattled, tried to pivot. All right, let's talk about the work then," he said, flipping through his note cards with a touch of desperation. "Your new film, it's raw, it's real. What was it like diving into that kind of role?" It was a good question, a chance to reset, but Johnny's expression didn't soften. He tilted his head, studying Kimmel like he was weighing whether to keep going or walk away. "It's not about diving in," he said finally. "It's about living it. You don't play a role like that, you carry it. You feel every scar, every weight. That's what makes it real." The audience was eating it up, their applause rolling through the studio like a wave. Kimmel nodded, trying to ride the momentum. "That's powerful, man," he said, his voice softer now, almost genuine. "You bring that to every role, don't you? That's why people connect with you." For a moment, it seemed like the tension might ease, like the conversation could find its way back to the usual late-night banter. But then Kimmel, perhaps sensing he was losing the room, made another misstep. But, with all that intensity, don't you ever just want to go back to something lighter, like another Pirates movie? Fans would lose their minds for that. Johnny's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. He took a step back, his hands dropping to his sides. You think that's what this is about? Giving fans what they want, like I'm some trained monkey. The words cut through the room, sharp and unyielding. The audience went silent, sensing the line that had been crossed. Kimmel's face flushed, his hands fumbling with his cards. Johnny turned, his gaze sweeping the crowd, then back to Kimmel, his expression unreadable but charged with something dangerous, something final. The studio felt like it had been sucked dry of air, every eye fixed on Johnny Depp as he stood there, his words still echoing. His accusation, calling himself a trained monkey, hung heavy, a direct challenge to the glossy, predictable world of late-night television. Jimmy Kimmel, his face a mix of shock and forced composure, gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening. The audience, caught in the crossfire, didn't dare make a sound, their earlier cheers replaced by a tense, electric stillness. The cameras, ever hungry, zoomed in on Johnny's face, catching the storm in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he clenched and unclenched his fists. Kimmel tried to salvage the moment, his voice strained but still clinging to his host's charm. Hey Johnny, come on, I didn't mean it like that, he said, leaning forward, his smile more plea than reassurance. I'm just saying, you're a legend, man. People want to see you in those big roles, that's all. He spread his hands, gesturing to the crowd, but the response was muted, a few scattered claps that fizzled out quickly. The room wasn't his anymore, it belonged to Johnny, whose presence seemed to dwarf the stage, the lights, even the show itself. Johnny didn't move, didn't sit back down. He tilted his head, his gaze piercing through Kimmel's deflection. You don't get it, do you? He said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. This isn't about what people want, it's about what's real, what matters. I'm not here to dance for applause or churn out sequels to make someone's wallet fatter. His words were slow, deliberate, each one landing like a blow. The audience stirred, a few nodding, others whispering, drawn into the raw conviction in his voice. It was as if he was speaking not just to Kimmel, but to everyone who'd ever tried to box him in. Kimmel, sensing the show slipping further out of his control, tried to pivot again. All right, let's talk real then, he said, his tone shifting to something more serious, though his eyes betrayed his unease. You've always been about the art, Johnny, we get that. But the industry, it's a tough place. You've fought battles most people can't imagine. How do you keep going? It was a better question, one that might have worked earlier, but now it felt like too little, too late. Johnny's lips curled into a faint, almost bitter smile, the kind that said he'd heard this all before. Keep going, Johnny repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. He took a step closer to the desk, his shadow falling across Kimmel's note cards. You keep going because you have to, because the alternative is letting them win, letting them turn you into someone you're not. He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes scanning the audience, connecting with them in a way Kimmel couldn't. I've lost a lot, Jimmy, more than most people know, but I'm still here, still fighting, because I believe in what I do, not the fame, not the money, but the work. The crowd erupted, a wave of applause that shook the studio, some standing, others shouting his name. It wasn't just support, it was a release, a collective exhale from a room that had been holding its breath. Kimmel, for the first time, looked, genuinely, out of his depth, his usual quips useless against the weight of Johnny's words. He tried to interject, raising a hand. That's inspiring, man, really, he said, his voice almost drowned out by the crowd. But sometimes you've got to play ball, right? Make a few compromises to keep things moving. Johnny's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing to slits. Compromises, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. I've compromised enough, Jimmy. I've given pieces of myself to this industry, to people like you who think it's all a game. He stepped back, his hands raised slightly, as if drawing a line. The audience went quiet again, sensing the shift, the finality in his tone. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Johnny cut him off, his voice rising. You want a show? You got one? But I'm not your puppet. With that, he turned, his boots heavy on the stage, and started walking toward the wings. Johnny Depp's boots echoed on the polished stage, each step a deliberate punctuation to the silence that gripped the studio. The audience, still reeling from his words, watched as he moved toward the wings, his leather jacket catching the stage. Lights and flashes of defiance. Jimmy Kimmel, now visibly flustered, stood up behind his desk, his hands raised in a half-hearted attempt to call him back. Johnny, come on man, don't go, he said, his voice cracking with a mix of panic and forced levity. But Johnny didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him, his silhouette shrinking against the vibrant backdrop as the crowd began to murmur. A low hum of shock and excitement. The cameras followed Johnny's every move, their lenses trained on his back, capturing the tension in his shoulders, the resolute set of his jaw. The audience was on edge, some standing, others craning their necks to see if he'd really walk off. Kimmel, desperate to regain control, tried to pivot to the crowd. "Well folks, that's Johnny Depp for you, always keeping it real," he said, forcing a laugh that fell flat. The audience didn't respond, their attention glued to Johnny, who paused at the edge of the stage, just before the curtain, as if reconsidering. The room held its breath, waiting for what came next. Johnny turned slightly, his profile sharp against the dim light of the wings. He didn't look at Kimmel, but at the audience, his eyes sweeping over them with a quiet intensity. "You want real," he said, his voice carrying across the studio, low but clear. "Stop buying the lies they feed you. Stop letting them tell you who to love, who to hate, who to be." The words hit like a spark in dry grass, igniting the crowd into a frenzy of applause, cheers, and shouts of support. A man in the back yelled, "You tell Johnny," and the room roared louder, the energy raw and unscripted. Kimmel, still standing, tried to interject, his microphone clutched tightly. "All right, Johnny, we hear you. We do," he said, his tone but tinged with urgency. "Let's sit down, talk this out, give the fans what they came for." It was a plea, a last-ditch effort to pull the show back from the brink, but Johnny shook his head, a faint, almost sad smile crossing his lips. "What they came for, Jimmy? They didn't come here to watch me play nice for your ratings." He gestured to the audience, who erupted again, their loyalty unmistakable. The producers, offstage, were scrambling now, their hushed voices audible in the brief lulls between the crowd's cheers. One gestured frantically to Kimmel, pointing at the clock, signaling the need to wrap or cut to commercial. But Kimmel, caught in the moment, ignored them. "Johnny, you're killing me here," he said, trying to inject humor, but his voice betrayed his nerves. "You're a guest, man. Let's keep it fun. Let's talk about the good stuff." He took a step toward Johnny, as if to bridge the gap, but Johnny held up a hand, stopping him cold. "I'm done with fun, Jimmy," Johnny said, his voice steady, final. "I came here to talk about my work, my art, not to be your sideshow." He turned fully now, facing Kimmel for the first time since he'd started walking away. The cameras caught the fire in his eyes, the weight of years spent fighting battles most couldn't imagine. "You want a spectacle? Find someone else." The audience was on its feet, their applause deafening, a wave of support that seemed to carry Johnny's words beyond the studio walls. Kimmel, now red-faced, opened his mouth to respond, but the crowd drowned him out, their cheers swelling into a chant of Johnny's name. The host glanced at the producers, then back at Johnny, who was already moving again, his steps purposeful as he headed for the curtain. The stage manager signaled for a commercial break, but the cameras stayed on Johnny, capturing every second of his exit. Just before he disappeared into the wings, he paused, glancing back one last time, not at Kimmel, but at the audience, his expression a mix of gratitude and resolve. Johnny Depp stood at the edge of the stage, the heavy curtain brushing against his shoulder, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the backstage lights. The audience's chants of his name still thundered through the studio, a tidal wave of support that seemed to hold him there, just for a moment. His eyes, shadowed but fierce, lingered on the crowd, taking in their faces, their raised hands, their raw, unfiltered energy. It was as if he was drawing strength from them, a silent pact between a man who'd bared his soul and the people who'd seen it. Jimmy Kimmel, still standing behind his desk, looked small in comparison, his hands gripping the microphone like a lifeline, his usual charisma buried under the weight of the moment. Johnny's gaze shifted, just for a second, catching Kimmel's eye. There was no anger there, not anymore, just a quiet, unyielding resolve. "You don't get to write my story, Jimmy," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, clear and steady. "None of you do." The words weren't loud, but they carried, slicing through the chaos with a precision that silenced the room. The audience didn't cheer this time. They listened, hanging on every syllable, as if he was speaking directly to each of them. Kimmel opened his mouth, but no words came, his usual quick wit failing him in the face of something so raw. With a final nod to the crowd, Johnny turned and pushed through the curtain, disappearing into the shadows of the wings. The audience erupted, a mix of applause, shouts, and gasps, their voices chasing him even as he vanished. The cameras, caught off guard, swung back to Kimmel, who stood frozen, his smile gone, his eyes darting to the producers for guidance. The stage manager's voice crackled through the crew's headsets, urgent and clipped, calling for a commercial break. The monitors flickered to a detergent ad, but the audience barely noticed, still buzzing, still processing what they'd just witnessed. Kimmel sank back into his chair, running a hand through his hair, his face a mix of disbelief and forced composure. "Well, folks," he said, his voice shaky as the cameras rolled again, "that was something else, wasn't it?" He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow, the audience's response tepid at best. He shuffled his note cards, glancing at the empty guest chair, then back at the crowd. "Johnny Depp, everybody. Never a dull moment. The applause was polite, but the energy was gone, the room still reeling from Johnny's exit. Backstage, the crew parted as Johnny moved through, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. A few staff members whispered, their phones already out. Posting, clips and snippets to social media, the moment already spiraling into viral chaos. Johnny didn't stop, didn't speak, just kept walking, his head high, his expression unreadable. A production assistant, young and nervous, approached with a clipboard, but one look from Johnny stopped her in her tracks. He wasn't angry, just done, his silence louder than any words he could have said. Outside, the night air was cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the studio. Johnny paused by the exit, lighting a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face. The distant hum of the city, mixed with the faint echo of the audience's cheers, still audible through the thick walls. He exhaled, watching the smoke curl upward, his mind already somewhere else, far from the stage, the cameras, the questions. He'd said what he needed to say, not for Kimmel, not for the headlines, but for himself, for the people who'd stood with him through the fire. Inside, Kimmel wrapped the segment, his voice steadier now, but lacking its usual spark. "We'll be right back with our next guest," he said, forcing a grin as the band played them out. The audience clapped, but their eyes kept drifting to the curtain, as if hoping Johnny would reappear. He didn't. The show went on, but it felt hollow, a shadow of the moment that had just unfolded. The story was already out there, racing across screens, sparking debates, dividing opinions. But for Johnny, it was just another step in a fight he'd been waging his whole life, a fight to be seen, to be heard, to be real.